Hey there, disruptors. Gip Erskine, values-driven coaching, and welcome to day 3 of Stop Losing on Price. I want to start today with something a little unusual. I want to tell you about a time I was embarrassed about a particular business meeting. It wasn't too awkward. It wasn't bad, but it was enough that I still remember it today very, very clearly. These two principals of an elevator company had flown in from Chicago to meet with me. Now, I imagine, you know, it was going to be a typical meeting. I'm in commercial real estate. I know buildings, I know tenants, I know property owners, I know service agreements, budgets, operations, but elevators? Uh, I, uh, I knew almost nothing about elevators beyond the fact that they needed to work reliably, and when they didn't, my phone rang immediately. So these two men came in, sat down, started talking about their company. And within a few minutes, I leaned across the table and said, "I want to work for you." And I have no idea why those words came out of my mouth. I had no elevator industry experience, no technical background, no reason to say it at all, except this. The way they talked about their work made me want to be a part of it. And I've thought about that moment many, many times since because it taught me something important about what actually happens when a service provider gets communication right. Let me tell you what they did. The first thing that struck me was that they were employee owned. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that every great company needs to be structured that way, but here's what employee ownership communicated in that room. It told me that every single person in the organization had a personal stake in the outcome, in how the work turned out. Not just the executive sitting across from me, the technician who shows up at 6 a.m. to run a diagnostic, the dispatcher who picks up the phone at midnight when a cab gets stuck between floors, the crew leader who decides whether to stick with that issue until it's properly resolved. Every one of them has skin in the game. And that translated immediately in my mind into a kind of confidence I didn't often feel when evaluating service providers. These weren't people who were going to shrug and point fingers when something went wrong. They were going to own it because they literally did. The second thing that struck me was that they told me they turned a lot of business down intentionally. Not because they lacked capacity and not because they were arrogant or snobby, but because some clients weren't the right fit for how they operated and what they were trying to build. Now, think about what that communicated to me as a potential client. They weren't desperate. They weren't chasing every signature. They were selective. And here's the part that I found fascinating in retrospect. By telling me that they turned business away, by making it clear that they were evaluating me just as much as I was evaluating them, they inadvertently elevated my status. I wasn't just another property manager with a building full of elevators that needed servicing. I was a potential partner they had chosen to pursue. And that's a completely different feeling. And it changed the entire dynamic of the room, but here's what sealed it for me. After all of that, after the ownership structure and the selectivity and their philosophy of service, they started talking about my world. Not their world, mine. Cost per foot, tenant satisfaction, ownership reporting requirements, operational risk and downstream consequences of equipment failure. They used the metrics I used. They spoke in the denominators I use every single day. They didn't make me translate their expertise into language I could work with. They had already done the translation themselves before they ever walked into my office. And I wanted you to feel what that was like from the inside because it's hard to describe unless you've experienced it yourself. It was relief. It was recognition. It was the sensation of sitting across from someone and thinking, they get me. They understand what I care about. They understand what ownership asks of me. They understand what tenants notice. They understand what keeps me up at night. And suddenly the conversation stopped feeling like a sales call. It started feeling like a collaboration, like two men on the same side of the table, even though they were sitting across from each other. And that's the power of speaking someone's language. Not your language, theirs. Now, let me contrast that with what I saw far more often, because I want to be fair here. I don't think most service providers default to talking about themselves because they're self-absorbed. I think it's a habit, a well-intentioned defensive reflex. When you walk into a room and you want to establish credibility, when you feel the pressure of being evaluated, when you know that someone is deciding whether or not to trust you with a significant contract, the instinct is to prove that you know your stuff. So you talk about your stuff. You talk about your service, your equipment, your certifications, your process, your years of experience, your portfolio, all of which may be genuinely impressive. But here's the problem. The property manager across from you isn't sitting there wondering whether or not you know your stuff. They're wondering whether you know theirs, whether you understand what their tenants experience, whether you understand the metrics they get measured by, whether you can make their life easier or more complicated. Those are the questions running in the background of every meeting, and most service providers never address them. Not because they don't know the answers, but because nobody ever told them that was the conversation they were supposed to be having. It's a habit problem, not a knowledge problem, and habits can be changed. The shift is simpler than it sounds. Stop pointing the conversation at yourself, point it at them. Ask questions about their world before you say a single word about yours. What does success look like for this property over the next year? What's creating the most friction between you and your ownership right now? What does your best service relationship look like, and what makes it work? Now, those questions do something remarkable. They hand the other person permission to tell you exactly what they care about in their words, with their own metrics, using their own language. And then, when it's your turn to speak, you speak it back to them, not as manipulation, but as a genuine reflection of what you heard. And based upon what you just shared, here's our approach that connects to that outcome. That's it. That's the whole framework. And when you do it well, when you've genuinely listened and genuinely connected, the conversation stops being about your services. It becomes about their future. And that's a conversation worth having. Here's your challenge for today. Before your next client meeting or prospect conversation, write down 3 questions that have nothing to do with your services. Nothing. 3 questions about their world, their priorities, their pressures, their definition of a great outcome. And then ask them, and then listen. Just stop talking and listen. Really listen to what comes back. Because inside those answers, that's the language of value. The exact words and metrics and concerns that'll make your next proposal land completely differently than the last one. Tomorrow we're going to talk about what happens after the conversation. Because even when you said all the right things, buyers still need something more before they can confidently choose you. They need proof, not promises, not claims, proof. And most service providers are sitting on more of it than they realize. That's day 4. I'll see you then. Ever upward.